bring leadership ambitions,
look,
Mr. Howard?
you blokes are absolutely incorrigible.
We tried on that.
You are unbelievably incorrigible. Yes, what's your next question?
All political leaders have ambition. Ambition to achieve. For their country, their party, and themselves.
So many of us arrive up here with ambitions. I'm young enough to defer them for a lengthy period of time.
They might rise all the way up to the very top. So whether that would be for me or not is something that history will determine.
Ambition to leave a mark in history.
It is only natural that if you set your heart on a particular career, that you set your heart on going to the top. I keep being told by the media that I should take a long-term visionary view. We think we're pretty good, and we are.
What effect does a leader's ambition have on the people? In this series, we will see how the Government of Australia became the machinery for one leader's ambition to change the nation's idea of itself and its place in the world.
Can the Prime Minister give a guarantee that he has abandoned his plans to change the Australian flag, a flag under which so many Australians fought and died during World War II?
The Honourable Prime Minister, order the House will come to order.
Mr Speaker, let me remind the Leader of the Opposition that the symbols and the expression of the full sovereignty of Australian nationhood can never be complete while we have the flag in the corner of another country in the corner of our flag.
The member for Bedford. You sit down as well. You sit down.
I felt that in the past we ran the risk of allowing the narrative of Australia to fall into the hands of the left. And that was a huge mistake. Much of the debate about the Republic implied that somebody who was a monarchist was not a good Australian. And I felt the overtones of that whole debate were divisive and they were disrespectful of Australia's history. Now, I wanted to alter that.
John Howard's values were absorbed early in life. Unhappy with aspects of Australia's social direction, he would work to realise his vision of the nation Australia ought to be. In 1988, as opposition leader, he launched his political manifesto, Future Directions. The campaign images and words were carefully chosen to sell his message.
Son, you're Australian, that's enough for anyone to be.
It had John Howard's heart and soul in it. It was very much about values in Middle Australia. And I don't know why people have been surprised years later when John Howard did this on unions, or he did this on education, or he did that on security or guns, because it was all in Future Directions.
Australia needs plain thinking men like you.
Howard was very much aware of politics being a battle of ideas. And while it was first and foremost a battle of policy ideas, it extended to Australia's identity and to Australia's sense of itself. And Howard was very aware of that. And he was aware that while it would be perhaps a caricature to say that there was an explicit war going on, there was in a sense a tacit struggle for the hearts and minds of Australia.
I was, 10 at the time of the 1949 election that saw Chifley pushed out. I remember, of course, there'd been these terrible strikes and we had blackouts, and the country seemed to be fairly chaotic. There were troops in the coalfields.
It's often said that Howard's skill is more in politics than policy. But in at least one area, his ideological drive is unquestioned. his long-held political goal was to break down trade union power and rewrite Australia's workplace laws.
Genuine voluntary unionism will be introduced by a future Liberal National Party government. We will never achieve that degree of productivity and competitiveness that we need to improve our standards of living unless we reform our industrial relations system.
For the first 25 years of his life, he saw nothing around him in New South Wales but state Labor government. It permeates business, the churches, the universities, the schools, the institutions. And if you're in office for 25 years, you build up an enormous network of patronage. John Howard looked around New South Wales and saw hostile encirclement.
Unions are the traditional enemy of small business. Unions and Labor were dominating New South Wales politics, so he comes in to politics as a sort of anti-Labor warrior.
His modus operandi was always, if you could cut the amount of money flowing to the Labor Party through trade union dues, you've cut off some of the supply lines to my fundamental foremost enemy.
The common enemy is the Labor Party. And there's a few people in the Liberal Party who could learn something about who the common enemy is on occasions as well.
I think what we see in Howard's long campaign to reform industrial relations is a really strong personal conviction. This is one of the things that took Howard into politics, and it's one of the reasons he stayed there. This is something he really wanted to do.
Well, the reforms I wanted in industrial relations policy were fairly simple. They were to entrench voluntary unionism, end for all time any suggestion that people could be forced to join a union.
Right, all those in favour, raise your hand. Right, pretty unanimous, fellas.
I wanted a situation where if people wanted to negotiate directly with their employer without the involvement of a union, then they should have the right to do so. And I also wanted to change the unfair dismissal laws, which had acted as a burden on small business.
I wanted to deliver for all. I wanted to deliver for all those who supported us, but obviously it wasn't to be. Okay.
Well, he's come back the third time and people are slinging off at him, little Johnny. And I simply want to say this to you, Peter, and I say it with absolute sincerity. Don't get into a confrontational mode. Sit down with the trade unions, talk with them and work with them. It doesn't mean you'll agree on everything, but do try that approach.
It's advice that we are prepared to take, and I say it to you genuinely, Bob.
But John Howard had his industrial agenda prepared well before the 1996 election.
In 1995, when I was the Secretary to the Department of Industrial Relations, I was at an official dinner and found myself sitting next to John Sharp. He spoke to me about the intention that a new Liberal government would have in attacking the waterfront issues. The language was one almost of warfare, and I expressed my view that I thought that was a very ambitious objective, but he said to me, "Just watch us, we'll do it."
Crucial to the agenda was Peter Reith, John Howard's frontline warrior.
Question number 3. Talk about skewered good and proper. Question number 3. I ask you again.
Reithy was a very good ally for the Prime Minister. You could throw him any job which was go and look after pensioners, go and cuddle a horse, go and fix the economy, go and fix the waterfront. And the other thing he could do was line up the opposition and the Labor Party and cause them some grief and some heartburn.
The first step in the industrial agenda was to put the changes through Parliament and into Australian law.
Peter Reith, the Industrial Relations Minister, is set to introduce his Workplace Relations Bill, changing the way millions of Australians will work.
If you've got the most substantial overhaul of the industrial relations system, maybe this entire century, that you should make sure that you get it right.
The big thing was to get it through the Senate and talk to the Democrats, and I was the first, basically, in the Howard government to try the impossible, to negotiate with Cheryl and her team.
As it stands, the bill is, in the Democrats' view, too heavily balanced now against the interests of ordinary workers.
Democrats leader Cheryl Kernot was heavily lobbied over the Workplace Relations Bill. Both sides were trying to convince the public, and tension grew.
There's massive anxiety out there, whether they'll have a job, let alone what conditions they'll be working under.
We just wanted to say to people, whatever works in your business, we're going to allow you to do that, and we're going to provide you the legislative process. That meant we were introducing Australian Workplace Agreements, AWAs.
The government is pleased that we've been able to secure the passage of the legislation through the Senate.
But it's been at a cost. Cheryl Kernot says after 50 hours of talks, she's won 20 concessions.
I'm pleased that this is a really sensible compromise from both sides.
The government now needed to persuade business to take advantage of the new laws. But AWA take-up was slow.
We often felt that we were in the vanguard putting the argument and we were looking behind to see where everybody else was. I wouldn't say that business likes to be in the forefront, though, of the public debate often on these things because they suffer retribution from the unions and other sources.
There was another strategic focus. They wanted to break the power, really, of some of the unions that controlled, in their view, strategic industries in the country.
The Waterfront Union, MUA, was targeted for a battle that would demonstrate that the government was deadly serious and help bring business on side. In preparation, Reith spread a public message about rorts and thieving on the docks.
The policy of reforming the waterfront was something that had been in my mind and the minds of a lot of people on our side of politics for a long time. Because people in Australia had known how notoriously inefficient the Australian waterfront was, and something had to be done about it. And Peter Reith, with my very strong support and the very strong support of the government, put together a policy to do something.
The new AWAs enabled employers to override enterprise agreements. So Patrick Stevedore set out to train replacement workers in Dubai, away from the public gaze. And the government arranged loans of hundreds of millions of dollars to pay the MUA workers' redundancies. Patrick then fired the union workforce.
The company didn't tell its workers they were fired. Instead, Patrick left it up to the Federal Workplace Minister to deliver the bombshell. Patrick's 1,400 full-time wharfies sacked.
This is a decisive turning point in the history of reform on the Australian waterfront and gives Australia the opportunity to have a waterfront which will allow us to compete.
In Sydney and at docks around the country, wharfies arrived at work overnight to find themselves locked out.
I was supposed to work this morning at Darling Harbour, but before I left I turned the TV on and here's, of all people, Peter Reith telling me I'm sacked.
Our government promised it would fix up the waterfront, its rorts, its inefficiencies and its archaic work practice, and we meant it.
This emerging pattern of ugly, and to use your term, un-Australian conduct, the future you see for industrial relations in this country.
Our goal has been to get rid of the rorts. Our goal has been to end compulsory unionism on the Australian waterfront. I knew how important it was because this was a reform that Australia's exporters needed. I mean, our farmers had their exports rotting on wharves for years, some of them, and it was just time to bring an end to that.
The union movement managed to orchestrate fantastic community support at the docks. They were pickets, but because ordinary people were involved in it, mums and dads, it was seen as quite a benign exercise, almost an outpouring of Australians just sort of backing the wharfies. And I think the coverage of those pickets by the media was quite effective. There was a visual going on every day. You can just imagine how useful that was in some ways to the union movement to have gatherings outside the docks. You know, effectively the sausage sizzle going on and quite an emotional but controlled atmosphere outside the docks.
People had mortgages to pay, kids at school, a whole lot of personal and family problems that we needed to deal with and provide confidence to the employees to hang in there and to stick together. We had to raise millions of dollars. We paid every person who'd been locked out $200 a week.
The MUA took legal action, claiming the government had conspired with Patrick to sack their union workers. They sought a court injunction to stop them.
The one conspiracy on this issue is a conspiracy between the Labor Party and the MUA and the ACTU. And I'll tell you what that conspiracy is. That conspiracy is to maintain compulsory unionism on the Australian waterfront.
The federal court granted the injunction, ordering that the workers be reinstated. And the High Court, considering a Patrick appeal, upheld that decision. No ruling was made on the conspiracy, but within a month of the lockout, the MUA workers returned.
They went back onto the docks, into their jobs, and it was then that it became less a legal issue but an old-fashioned negotiating between the union and the employer about what should happen next, and so ultimately there was a settlement.
And look, that's what should have happened in the first case. If the government hadn't been there, waving a $150 million cheque at Patrick stevedoring and saying, look, if you adopt our interventionist strategy, sack all of your workers and bring in a replacement workforce on AWAs, this dispute would not have happened.
The facts are that the union has half the membership it once had. It has half the subscriptions coming in. They've spent a lot of their stockpile on legal fees.
It always looked, I think, to a large section of the public that the union had really won that dispute by being able to return and get their jobs back. But ultimately, it was pretty clear pretty soon that Chris Corrigan had quite a big victory in terms of the way that he could run his business.
We never flinched, we never blinked. And sure, we copped a lot of abuse for it, but Australia's a better place for what's happened. And I look back on my political career and I say to myself, well, did I ever do anything worth doing? Well, that was, I reckon I did a couple of things, and that was one of them, definitely.
Peter Reith did a fantastic job in relation to that. It was very tough, it was quite ugly on occasions, and it was physically intimidating for him on quite a number of occasions, but he stuck to his guns, and we now have productivity through the roof on the Australian waterfront, and we'll never go back.
I think the Waterfront campaign showed to business that we were quite serious about taking some tough actions in order to reform the Australian economy. So I think it was important in also helping to mobilise further business support for the government's reform agenda.
But progress was slow. Resistance to AWAs from business and unions continued. As late as 2005, only 2.5% of the workforce had been signed up.
Part of the problem was that major players, especially big unions and big employers, had found relationships where they could live with the rigid industrial systems that we had in place.
The unions were now relatively weak after the reforms that started in the 1990s. The unions didn't have the capacity to paralyse cities in the way they once had. And I think this led Howard to really misjudging how much sympathy there was for his position out there in the electorate.
But Howard was patient and determined, and his chance would come later, when the 2004 election would give him control of both houses of Parliament.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr Andrews and I welcome you to the launch, what I might call a premium explanatory memorandum of the government's proposed workplace relations changes.
With no Senate obstruction, Howard would finally grasp his opportunity to break union power by legislating his full industrial agenda, now called Work Choices.
I can look the workforce of Australia in the eye tonight and say, look at what has happened under my Prime Ministership over the last 9.5 years. I can tell them that this reform will further strengthen the Australian economy, and I can tell them directly that the foundation of more jobs and higher wages in the future is a stronger economy.
Work choices try to take the idea of individual self-reliance to what might have appeared to an economic rationalist a logical conclusion, but to an Australian voter, this was never how far you would take the project. There was one thing, that's lasted, I think, 100 and something years of Australian federation, and that is that the government sits in the centre between boss and union.
It was Howard's bridge too far, and it nicely encapsulates the sort of dilemma that the politician has. The leader has an agenda, the people want something else. The problem of leadership is always, how do you balance the needs of the group, of the society, with the wishes of the leader? And if the leader refuses to compromise, eventually that will lead to downfall.
The principal objective I had was to build a narrative about the Australian achievement that was positive. That was my objective. It's a wonderful nation. It's the greatest on the earth. We think we're pretty good, and we are. You would achieve that by the language you use, how you react to particular events, the emphasis you place on the history of the country, the emphasis you place on symbols. You achieve it by using the bully pulpit, if you like, of the Prime Ministership to talk about the Australian achievement. And it can have an influence. I mean, Paul Keating made that speech at Redfern, which was extremely critical of the impact of white civilisation on Indigenous people.
We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers.
What is the emphasis? Is the emphasis on the achievement, or is the emphasis on the blemish? And I think it's very important to put the emphasis on the achievement. We no longer have perpetual seminars about our national identity. We no longer agonise as to whether we're Asian or European or too British or not British enough or too close to the Americans or whatever. We actually rejoice in what has always been the reality, and that is that we are gloriously and distinctively Australian.
To achieve the objectives that he wanted, Howard had to change the public mind. And he did it partly by propaganda, which leads to the observation Paul Keating used to make, that if the government changes, the country changes. He thought he could do this by talking to the Australian people and making them proud of Australian history.
Well, I felt that we were becoming too apologetic about the relationship between Indigenous and other Australians. I always believed that the greatest blemish on Australian history was the treatment of Indigenous people. I never contested that. Nobody can objectively contest that. But I did not believe that the solution to the problem lay in having two separate streams in Australia.
I think there's a real struggle politically and philosophically and ideologically about how to accommodate Aboriginal people within the nation. And I think as a nation, we still haven't come to terms with, what is the legitimate place of Aboriginal people in this country?
Indigenous people had gained ground under the previous government, especially through the High Court's Mabo judgment. Now, in its Wick decision, the High Court endorsed Mabo and further judged that native title was not extinguished by pastoral or mining leases. This aroused fear and anger among farmers and miners.
You're the boss, and I think you're making a bloody mess of it.
I have 8-month-old twins and a 3-year-old, and I worry about their future.
Please don't believe this fear-mongering that says native title claimants can throw you off your property. They can't. We will never, ever allow that to happen. We will guarantee that farmers can carry on their activities and what they would regard as normal and proper development of their properties without interference from native title claimants.
It was very clear that the Howard government was never going to negotiate with us as Aboriginal people, essentially drafted a 10-point plan which was delivered to us as an ultimatum. This was the way it was going to be. He was hell-driven and hell-bent in trying to force it through Parliament.
The Howard Plan provoked dismay in Aboriginal communities. Some would now be denied all access to their traditional lands.
It's sad about it. It makes them sad that there's a gate there that's stopping them from going through the country they've once used to own.
We are Aboriginal people. He's making policy about us. We want to know what's in that policy.
They are, we must never forget, only the government of the day. They are not God.
I believe that my 10-point plan provides the only basis of a proper approach. I also need to, in the name of truth and the name of a frank discussion of this issue, to repudiate the claim that my 10-point plan involves a massive handout of freehold title at taxpayer expense. That is an absolute myth. It is absolutely contrary to the fact, and I absolutely repudiate it.
I think that really sort of set the tone almost for a very long time under the Howard administration as to, how that relationship would be. And I think perhaps there were some enormously missed opportunities too of not engaging, both on our part as Indigenous people, but also on the part of government.
Howard's handling of the issue was criticised from all sides. But after 18 months, his Wick amendments successfully passed through the Senate and into Australian law.
Well, something I learnt out of that. I think Wick took forever because I saw virtue in having a long period of consultation and talking to everybody. And what I don't think I appreciated at the time was that if you set out to talk to everybody, it will take an eternity. And what the public really always wants is they want you to do a bit of talking to people, but having done that bit of talking, they then want to know what you're going to do. Now, I tried rather too hard to consult everybody, and I think in the process I lost a bit of skin.
Tensions between Howard and Indigenous society grew. A plan for cooperation had been worked on by the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council since 1991. Midway through the government's second term, its proposals were presented to the nation.
A 10-year-long journey of healing reached its destination but not its conclusion today, as the historic but contentious reconciliation document made its way to the steps of the Opera House. Inside there was plenty of fanfare and a standing ovation, but the document was not handed to Prime Minister John Howard, who thought its words were not the right ones. Instead, that honour went to 5-year-old Natasha Fay.
Just one small step for you, Prime Minister, can be a giant step forward for the nation.
I had deep reservations about an apology, and that's well understood and well known. I felt we had really got to a situation where many people who had what I could call traditional views about Australian history and Australian achievements were made to feel uncomfortable. This weekend is an occasion for all Australians to honour the contribution of the Indigenous people of Australia to the life of this country. Now, the people who said reconciliation was stalled, it's their version of reconciliation that was stalled, because their version of reconciliation involved a treaty, it involved customary law, it involved other things that I would never agree to, because I thought they were bad for the country.
I felt berated by the Prime Minister of the day, by Mr Howard, talking constantly about the black arm band view of history, and that he won't be, almost sort of finger shaking, like it was almost rubbing salt in your wound and just sort of get on with it, it's tough for us all sort of thing.
The Canberra mob should come and see the communities, and they should travel on the road to feel the knock of the road. They should come and look for themselves and see how we live. any decision making, they should come and talk to us first. See if we agree to it, We should talk.
Howard, he wasn't prepared to say sorry to the stolen generation. It wouldn't have cost him anything. I think he would have won some hearts among the Aboriginal people if he had said sorry person when he was the Prime Minister.
The challenge I have faced around Indigenous identity politics is in part an artefact of who I am and the time in which I grew up. I have always acknowledged the past mistreatment of Aboriginal people. Yet I have felt, in the end, I could not accept that reconciliation required a condemnation of the Australian heritage I had always loved and owned.
The lack of an apology or resolution with Aboriginal Australia was an issue many in the mainstream felt strongly about. The day after the Opera House corroboree ceremony, hundreds of thousands of people crossed bridges in cities and towns in support of reconciliation.
And we're showing that Howard does not speak for the people, and this is what the people want. We want reconciliation now.
For the former Prime Minister, John Howard, to treat so dismissively those acts of symbolism that are obviously very, very important to Indigenous Australians, I just simply do not understand it.
I think there's a lot of goodwill for reconciliation in Australia, always was. And we should have looked symbolically as if we were supporting and taking that further rather than symbolically trying to hold it back.
You can still preserve special identity. I mean, there are plenty of communities in Australia that have their own distinctive qualities that are fully integrated into the Australian community.
Howard builds his political strategy out of a combination of economic liberalism, which is reforming, changing things, and social conservatism. So once Labor, in a sense, has done a lot of the hard yards on economic reform, he is able to base his electoral appeal to some extent on this social conservatism, on people who are a bit uncomfortable about aspects of the way in which Australia has changed demographically, who are worried that multiculturalism puts too much emphasis on difference and not enough emphasis on the things that tie Australians together.
But early in Howard's first term, a new voice was heard, appealing to the same constituency.
Unless people want to become Australian and respect our laws and way of life here, well then don't come here at all, because they will be of no use and benefit to us as a united nation and a united people.
The Hanson phenomenon grew rapidly and the media coverage escalated. Howard and his office had to decide on the approach he should take.
On the one hand, she said some things that were quite wrong, but there were other things that she referred to which were seen by some in the community as just reacting against excessive political correctness, which I thought made more sense. That if somebody disagrees with the prevailing orthodoxy of the day, that person should not be denigrated as a narrow-minded bigot.
There is a nerve that she's touching the community.
Howard really had a very astute political antenna. He listened very carefully during Hansonism to what people were saying, held back his immediate response and thought about where those people were coming from and came up with a carefully formulated political response designed to keep them on side.
She did tap some racism, but that wasn't the real explanation for the popularity that she enjoyed. The real explanation was that when you have a time of rapid economic change, some people feel very dislocated and very disconcerted. And you've got to, by a continuity of values and institutions, provide them with reassurance.
We must not foster Aboriginal culture as an alternative society to our own.
In a sense, Hanson was doing a job for him. She was going out there and making the arguments against the sorts of people that Howard resented. There was a political correctness around that needed to be dissolved. And if he licensed Hanson to do that, he wouldn't need to do it directly.
But while Howard tried to reassure and reclaim this disgruntled constituency, the wave of anti-ethnic and anti-Aboriginal sentiment was growing. The One Nation Australian racism story was also running strongly overseas all this time, particularly in Asia.
单一民主党的反亚裔种族主义政策主张，不仅是不得人心的，而且也是违背。
More trouble for Mr. Howard. On the eve of talks, Singapore has bluntly told the government to end the race row or trade could be affected.
There were some interesting reactions offshore from our foreign affairs people saying, oh, must do something, must stop her. It was easier said than done. But then pressure built up, and the Prime Minister had to come out and attempt to put her back in the box.
The political campaign mounted by the member for Oxley seeks to exploit fear and instability. She is wrong when she says that Australia is in danger of being swamped by Asians. She is wrong to seek scapegoats for society's problems.
More than a year after Pauline Hanson entered Parliament, John Howard publicly spoke against her.
Australian jobs.
But the forces unleashed were not halted by one speech, and Howard was now called on often.
There's a 4-minute interview that I did last night with Hanson about her speech.
But is that going to mean that I only get half the rest of the time because...
No, this is separate. That's why hers is kept short. You've got
4 minutes.
Well, that's pretty short.
She's worse.
No, don't worry. It doesn't impact on your time.
All right.
Prime Minister Pauline Hanson has warned that Aboriginal Australians and the United Nations are plotting to establish taxpayer-funded Aboriginal states. Are these sentiments racist?
Well, I've read the speech she made last night, and I've got to say it's not only an inaccurate, dishonest speech, but it verges on the deranged.
Quite a few people are coming out now with personal comments towards me. I'm not supposed to have an opinion, and it's a shame because I got into this job to have a say in what direction I would like to see this country go, and I'm being criticised for it.
Probably one of the most lasting impacts of Howard's engagement with the problem of the people of Australia has been his victory in diluting broad public cultural support for ideas of multiculturalism. For Howard, Australia was one nation, one society, one culture. And for him and his supporters, that is as it should be.
We expect all who come here to make an overriding commitment to Australia, its laws and its democratic values. We want them to learn about our history and heritage, and we expect each unique individual who joins our national journey to enrich it with their loyalty and their patriotism. We have in so many areas endeavoured to introduce consumer choice, and our funding policies in relation to health and education reflected that. This is a parent-driven policy. This is what Australian parents want.
And that every school have a functioning flagpole and fly the Australian flag.
Lucy and Christian, I want to present you this flagpole as a gift to the school community from the Commonwealth Government, and something that we would like all schools to do all around Australia, and to have the Australian flag up there each day as a reminder of something that binds us all together.
John Howard lives for an idea that Australia is best served with the following set of values. You just need to know how to look through a lot of the rhetoric. It is family values, it is respect for the flag, respect for the monarchy, respect for our war tradition. I mean, that in a sense is John Howard.
I certainly espouse socially conservative values, the importance of the family, the importance of marriage, the importance of hard work, the value of small business, what you might loosely call the Protestant work ethic. All of those things were part of the suite of values that I thought were important, and self-reliance.
The difference between the John Howard coalition and the Labor Party that he succeeded was the role of government. John Howard wanted to use government as a weapon to promote greater individual self-reliance in the economy and society. It's a paradox for John Howard, though, because he had to grow the government to be able to promote the idea of private health insurance or private schools. In the end, a lot of taxes were raised to give back to people so they could spend it in the private sector.
My impression of Howard is that he too has not so much a program in the way Whitlam did, where, you know, everything in a sense was linked to everything else, and if you gave up one bit of it, the whole thing would come apart. Howard is a realist and a pragmatist, but he had some sorts of issues, some core principles and objectives that he simply wasn't going to let go.
Father, we thank you for the night.
We've been very strong on choice in education, and as a result we have seen a very significant growth of low-fee independent schools of different denominations, in particularly the outer suburbs of the major cities, and that has been a huge thing.
Allahu Akbar. Subhana Rabbi al-A'la.
And in order for it to be a real choice, the fees in independent schools have got to be within the reach of ordinary people, and our policies have made that possible. You now have, 33% of Australian school children attending Catholic and independent schools, and that's a significant rise in what it had been.
Nobody is against parents exercising their choice about where to send their individual children. What we're really talking about, though, here is the capacity of the public purse to fund that choice. That's really the issue.
I actually think that that's bad social policy as well as bad educational policy. If you are segregating children from other children of different ethnic groups, then we have, I think, a bit of a time bomb in terms of tolerance and the sorts of things that we pride ourselves on in our multicultural society.
I think what they really wanted to do was ideological. They wanted to foster the development of a parallel private system in education, in healthcare and so on. The end effect of that, I think, has been a development of a two-tier system. The public system, the private system. Those who can afford one and those who can't.
Opposition is mounting to the federal government's radical cuts to university funding. While the opposition and Democrats are threatening to block the bill in the Senate, the Young Liberals say students shouldn't have to bear the brunt of the budget cuts.
Shame, Liberal, shame! Shame, Liberal, shame! Shame, Liberal, shame!
Higher education cuts began with Labor in the late 1980s, but the Coalition's funding to universities dropped to under 40%. Foreign enrolments and private finance were called on. Fees increased and full-fee courses were introduced. A change evolved in the culture of higher education.
John Howard's not an intellectual and wouldn't claim to be one. And by and large, I think that reflects the fact that so many of them have criticised him for so long. And I think John Howard, being a rather stubborn man, just thought he just didn't need to be lectured at by well-educated people sitting in taxpayer-subsidised jobs and in universities or at the ABC or at SBS. He just didn't need to be lectured at.
I think there was a certain degree of hostility between the Howard government and the tertiary sector. I think it did become, if you like, caught up in the cultural wars, the notion that the universities were inhabited by, left liberals that were hostile to the conservative side of politics.
The days of dreaming that we could have completely free university education are gone. That was tried by the Whitlam government, didn't work, didn't improve the opportunities for people from lower socio-economic groups to go to university. I think it is only reasonable that students make some contribution, and I don't think any government can guarantee that every person who wants to go to university will be able to do so.
And are you actually forcing West Australian students to take up full fee paying places?
No, we're not forcing them to. What we've tried to do is to bring about a balanced increase in resources going into universities.
The last thing we should be doing if we want to survive and prosper over the next century is penny pinching with our universities. Why is that a smart idea? I mean, are we all going to get jobs pulling iron ore out of the ground? No. We've got to get jobs using our brains. That's where the future is. Everybody knows that.
There's been a consistency in John Howard's approaches over the years to subtly denigrate the public sphere as being somehow immaterial, not very important, but certainly in his view it would be an area that he somehow associates with the Labor Party. In the world of business, where it's privately owned, where there are no such compromises, Howard thinks these are my people, this is my territory.
Private investment is a way of opening up opportunity for people at the higher education level. And there have never been so many students, both Australian students and overseas students, engaged in higher education in Australia than there are at the present time. In fact, Australia would be about number 3 in world rankings in terms of private investment in education, and that is to a large extent a result of the policies of the Howard government.
Well, I think it means the state sloughing off responsibility for these public goods, and so that all that the government does is to play the role of the night watchman, which is to look after private property and do nothing else. So the citizen actually becomes a consumer. And I think now we can actually talk about consumer citizens. That's what we've become.
I think the most significant shift or change, if you like, under the Howard administration was this notion that somehow that individuals should be held responsible for their own decision making, you should be self-reliant, self-resourceful, all of that. And yet when it came to Aboriginal people and Aboriginal affairs, it was this pressure to force people back into the mainstream, somehow believing that this somehow, if you just crunch it through, Aboriginal people would be better off.
In a statement, the Prime Minister was announcing the fate of Territory Indigenous communities and sweeping aside the powers of the Northern Territory government.
It is interventionist. It does push aside the role of the Territory to some degree. I accept that.
As the end of his 4th term approached, Howard and Indigenous Affairs Minister Mal Braff declared a national emergency following a report into child abuse in the Northern Territory's Indigenous communities. They announced a direct federal intervention as a response.
We launched the report, and then there was that terrible silence from the NT. And then, of course, the Prime Minister then stepped in and filled the silence with what's become known as the intervention, and he sent the army in.
It's, I think, a really striking example of the Howard approach. There had been reports for 18 years pointing to just these problems. Suddenly, within months of the election, it became a crisis of such urgency that the government, the national government, had to intervene.
It was the right thing to do, and it represented an historic shift in approaches to Indigenous policy. I mean, we in this country wasted 20 or 30 years on notions of self-determination in relation to Indigenous policy. 20 to 30 years. And it was all a failure.
He wasn't there to really help us in getting us the way we want things, the way we want it. It was them. It's how they want it. And how they want to run the show. How they want to control our life. And that's not good.
What I think Australian people see now is a real opportunity to achieve better health, better education, greater personal responsibility, less drunkenness, more family and parental responsibility, greater protection for Indigenous children. If people commit a crime, they're punished for it, and there's not some vague idea of somehow or other you've got to live with it because it's always happened or something. I mean, it's just appalling.
It's like we're invisible, like Aboriginal people were of no account, and we were these sort of passive people, irresponsible, uneducated, undisciplined people that had to have things done for them.
Did the government get every decision right? No.
but this is the democratic experiment. This is what we are engaged in, for better or for worse, and nobody has yet discovered a better way of managing these. I think if we look back on the record, I think there will be some enormous achievements and there will be some failures.
The years of Liberal rule have left Australia a different country. But though John Howard's struggle for Australia's hearts and minds was increasingly successful, we were changing anyway. A society and its people are always changing. Change did come from his influence. Change also brought about his downfall.
We had been an achieving government, and I didn't feel any sense when we went out of office, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done that. I didn't have that feeling because we'd had the time and the opportunity to implement very big reforms and very big changes, and to project a view of Australia that I believed in. The cultural diversity of so much of the business community of Australia is an indispensable element in winning new markets. I believe that this country has badly neglected the teaching of Australian history. This is something I believe in very strongly because it's about values. I have believed for a long time that within local communities there has been a growing hunger for greater guidance on values, spiritual guidance, and general moral and other counselling.